Leadership presence is a lacking skill in this day and age.
So if you want to change an organization's culture, you got to change the stories that your employees share with each other. It's just turning the thing flipping upside down.
Welcome to Start With a Win, where we unpack franchising, leadership, and business growth. Let's go. And coming to you from Area 15 Ventures and Start With a Win headquarters, it's Adam Contos with Start With a Win. Do you ever wonder how some companies maintain a competitive edge while others struggle to keep up? Today on Start With a Win, we're delving into the world of strategic management with Jay Barney, a true powerhouse in the field. With over 100 articles, 8 books, and countless accolades under his belt, Jay's insights are like gold for anyone seeking to understand what sets successful businesses apart. From his tenure at prestigious institutions like the University of Utah to his extensive consulting work with top organizations, Jay brings a wealth of expertise to the table. So if you're ready to unlock the secrets behind sustained competitive advantage, you're in for a treat with Jay Barney. Jay, welcome to Start With a Win.
Good to see you too.
You've been traveling all over. I know you just got off of an international trip talking about the new book that I want to talk about today, The Secret of Culture Change. Here's the magic, folks. How to build authentic stories that transform your organization. The key word there, stories. I mean, this is a really cool thing because, we've always seen storytelling as a big part of culture. You go back to the, cave dwellings and people would draw stories on cave walls, or you look at, like Native American culture was always about the storyteller in the tribe, telling stories to the young braves and how they can carry forth the culture of their tribe. But you dug into business. And I want to get into that extensively. But first of all, you are a business school professor also. Correct. This is a lot of factual information that has gone into this. It's not just somebody going, hey, you should tell a story to adjust your culture. So give us a little bit of your background and why you wrote this book.
That's a great question. I'm actually a professor of strategic management. And interestingly enough, I don't think you'd notice in the book, I take a pretty economic approach to analyzing strategies. So my training and my previous position is economics. That said, as I've worked with companies and helping them choose and modify and implement their strategies, I have routinely over the years bumped into the problem of a mismatch between a new strategy we're going to implement and a firm's organizational culture. I first had this experience in the 80s, so how I spent. At the time, I was doing a lot of work with a well-known company. I won't mention its name, just the initials, HP. And at the time, I can't say anything about it now, but at the time, HP had an amazing organizational culture. It was so ennobling and enabling, and at HP, when a business leader developed a new technological idea and invested in it, it didn't work, it was treated as an opportunity to learn. So a very impressive place. As I was working with them, I got a phone call from another company. That won't go truly unnamed. And they asked me, they said, we understand you know a lot about HP. I said, yeah, I do. Well, we compete with them. I said, I know. We're not doing very well. I said, yeah, I know that too. And they said, what we'd like to do, we just finished it. They said, we just finished a 6-month study of our organizational culture, and we decided we're risk averse. Now, in the Valley, they were known as the most risk-averse firm in this industry. It's a 6-minute conversation, not a 6-month conversation. But the fact that it took them 6 months to figure out they were risk-averse is, in fact, an indicator of just how risk-averse they were. And so they said, what we want to do is we want to hire you to help us get rid of our old culture and put a new culture in place. And we want you to do that in 6 weeks. I knew that was absurd on its face. Okay. I knew that they really weren't interested in changing their culture changes, but I'd sign up. But I also had to be honest with myself that I didn't have a theoretical tool or a methodology that I could use that I could legitimately say is designed to change an organization's culture. In fact, we talk about it in the book. That's people who I respect, who are really change management scholars of the highest order, really are very skeptical about the ability to change an organization's culture. And so I was sort of in that same mode. I'm not sure how to do it. I don't have the tools to do it. Culture is diffused, it's intangible, all those things that make it difficult to change. No one's in charge of culture, Everyone's in charge of culture, therefore no one's in charge of culture. And yet I just kept bumping into it as a problem and as a challenge that's mismatched between strategy and culture. Then what happened is I met Manuel Emmer, and we happened to go to the same church, and he just had moved to where I live in Park City, Utah, and he said, he was a recently retired 4-time CEO. So as I often do, I said, "Hey, I'm a business school professor. Let's have lunch together. See how athletes are. What's going on?" And so that lunch was scheduled for an hour, and 4 hours later, we had basically debriefed his career, and what he had specialized in was culture change.
Wow!
And he had done this 4 times. He didn't know that he was in culture change. I labeled it. He really understood what it meant. And he also had a methodology that he had developed, also not explicitly. It was just sort of, this is what he did. And it was having to do with building stories to replace old. So you take old culture stories and you build new stories that replace those old stories and you change the culture.
Wow. So you guys studied a whole bunch of different companies
yeah,
for this book and pulled out some of the best stories or the results that you were looking. Obviously, comparatively speaking, you don't have a story. You really don't have a great path for your culture, I would assume.
Well, this is what we know. We know that that cultures are created and maintained through the stories that employees tell each other about what's expected at a firm, the norms, the expectations of the firm, and so the stories are already there. Okay. They may not be the stories you want to be there, but they're already being shared, and with social media, they're shared even more efficiently than they ever were in the past.
So you mean it's not the employee handbook? That's
I'm glad you're sitting down. I know that's a shocking conclusion. One of our stories is a version of the employee handbook. An entrepreneur generates this list of values that he thinks his company should have. Then he writes it up and goes to his office, thinks deeply, and writes it up and puts it on the wall. And a week later, he asks one of his subordinates, he says, "Well, what do people say about my list of values?" And he said, "They're mocking them." He said, "They're mocking my values?" He said, "Yeah, because the values of the organization, the values you list are unrelated. And besides, some of the values you think are so important, we don't think are important." And so, there's very little to do with it. I will say this, going back to HP, the HP handbook actually reflected their culture very, very well. It's called the HP way. I don't know if you remember that. Interesting. It was unusual in that way, but most of the time, the handbook is sort of independent of what's going on culturally.
Okay, so I want to bring up something that I think this is probably overplayed and misunderstood a lot, and that's this Drucker quote of culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Right.
Having spoken with you before, obviously there's more to it than that. Can you tell us, because everybody always goes culture eats strategy for breakfast, but that's where the conversation stops.
Yeah. Well, so you should know, I've spoken to the people at the Drucker Institute, and they actually say that Drucker never said that, but that's a separate issue. So he could have said it, but apparently they couldn't find it. I couldn't find the source, but nevertheless, I qualify that in the book. I think the fact that culture eats strategy for breakfast really shows that if there's a mismatch between your strategy and the culture of the organization, the culture will dominate. But that statement is useless. It has no managerial impact if you can't change culture. Now, one way you can do it is you can modify your strategy to make it a little more consistent with your culture. But if your strategy is market determined, that is, you've gone from a regulated to an unregulated market, you've gone from a local to a global market, whatever is going on, and you've had to change your strategy in order to keep up with and to gain competitive advantage, keep up with competitors and to gain competitive advantage, then you're going to have to change your strategy, but that implies the need to change your culture. And the Drucker points out the need to change the culture, but does not provide a methodology for doing so.
So you've figured out a methodology for that,
well,
it seems.
No, I think what we did is we described what people were already doing. I don't think we invented anything here. I mean, as I've said to you before, the heroes in this book are the business leaders who shared their experiences on changing culture with us. We were able to describe it, label it, and make some logical sense out of it. But yeah, this is very much an inductive kind of study where we found out what these people were doing.
Okay,
and then we described it.
Well, let's dig into that then. Give me a basis for the study and what, how you got to proving your, or finding your outcomes, I guess, in the study.
Sure. So the logic is actually incredibly simple, I think, which is we've already established that we know that culture is created and maintained in organizations by the stories employees tell each other. So if you want to change an organization's culture, you got to change the stories that your employees share with each other. That's pretty straightforward. Right. And how do you do that? Well, you got to have new stories to replace the old stories because, social structure abhors a vacuum. So you have to build new stories. So what you want to do is you want to engage in, as a business leader, you want to engage in activities that are different than, contradict, in fact, the old culture, but are consistent with a new culture. You engage in those activities, then what happens is your employees see you're doing those things, and they start building the stories. They start saying, do you see what's going on here? Our CEO is doing this all of a sudden, which is inconsistent with the way we've been doing things historically. And that then leads to the diffusion of new stories throughout an organization that replace those old stories. And in that process, while the business leader engages in activities that lead to the stories being built, the diffusion of those stories means that the new culture is co-created with the business leader and with employees as they replace old stories with new stories.
Okay, so something I've noticed about businesses, most people in an executive role are not very, I guess, aggressively present in order to star in these stories, if you will. We've got, I always say we have leaders and we have hiders.
Sure. That's right.
The leaders lead, the hiders hide. And
I have to say, I was just working with a company and I was talking about culture change, which is really an issue in the company. There's no doubt about that. And one of the subordinates of the CEO I was talking to said, it turns out in order to build a story, you have to leave your office every once in a while. That's a hider.
Right. Interesting. But I mean, and it's fascinating because leadership presence is a lacking skill in this day and age in so many different businesses. You have leaders who are on video and physically present, who constantly set that tone and come up with those stories. And frankly, I mean, leaders, here's a cheat code for you. If you are present, you're going to develop stories most likely.
It's going to happen.
Exactly.
Whether you want them or not, that's the question, because it will happen by present. Well, we actually use a slightly different language, but I think it's very consistent with your observation. Our first criteria, we identified 6 attributes and stories you have to have in order to be likely to generate culture change. And the first one is authenticity. And by that we mean that the values and beliefs and expectations that you're trying to create with a new story have to be consistent with the business leader's personal values. This sounds like a pretty straightforward idea. It's actually quite important in its implications and counterintuitive in some ways as well. So, for example, if you believe that in order to implement a strategy, your culture needs to be transparent and risk-taking, and you as a business leader are neither transparent or risk-taking, you may not be the right person to lead culture change. Or another version of that is, let's suppose you've hired a senior manager who's worked with you for years, And he or she was hired in the old culture and is completely successful in that old culture. One of the high performers, but is very reluctant to go to new culture. It's not authentic to them. And so they're very concerned about doing it. That you may have to let that person go because they're not helping you build that new culture. So authenticity is actually it's what leads you to be present in a way that actually has a positive impact on culture change. Our experience, the data show overwhelmingly that employees can smell cultural hypocrisy from miles away.
Right.
And so, by the way, that doesn't mean you have to be perfect in terms of, implementing culture change. We have a story you may have read. This is about a really interesting guy. He's an entrepreneur and located in Singapore. And he's trying to build a culture of, it's a consulting, this particular business is a consulting kind of business that really respects the client and respects the consultants and tries to build this really high level of personal integrity and respect. And he's been working long hours, he's traveling all over the world, all that stuff. And he's leaving his office and late at night, tired. And this subordinate comes up to him and says, "Hey, I just finished that report that you wanted. Here it is." And he hands it to him, and he looks at it. "This is BS. There are a bunch of errors in it. This is BS." And throws it back at the guy and storms off home. Completely inconsistent with the culture he's trying to create.
Right.
And later on that night, it's now 9 after dinner, 9-10 o'clock at night. That subordinate calls him on the phone, says, "Listen, I really didn't like what happened there. I didn't like that you said my work was BS. Listen, I may have made mistakes. It's not perfect, but you were not being respectful for me. I mean, you weren't being the subordinate called him out on it. And this entrepreneur said, "You're right. I blew it. I personally apologize for doing that. I will look at your report tomorrow in new ways. And would you do me an additional favor? This is the building story part. Would you tell everyone that I screwed up and you called me on it? Tell everyone that story, because that's exactly what the kind of organization we want to have." So that's taking a mess up. I mean, he messed up. He did. And turn it into a story that actually helps build the culture change.
Wow.
Very clever guy.
Yeah. I mean, talk about authenticity also.
Oh, right there, man. Right there. If you're not, because you know how easy it is to get the ego involved here and how you can respond by saying, "Well, I'm your boss. Shut up." That's very effective. Yeah.
Right.
It's a big problem.
That is, I guess you can't go past step one if you don't have step one. I mean, that's
it is, and it is bad news for some CEOs I've worked with who say, "Yeah, I know we need to change our culture. I know we need to go in this direction, but that's not who I am."
Right.
We need a really outgoing, charismatic person. By the way, that's a little oversold. You don't have to be outgoing and charismatic to build stories, but it could help. But it's not a requirement.
Okay, so let me take you to the question of,
Sure.
We always hear, the top doesn't create the culture, but culture starts at the top. Is that kind of where that comes from?
So we would agree with that. I think we have no examples in our data. We have a data set of over 170 stories.
Okay.
From over almost 70 interviews that we get. And not all of them are positive outcomes. Not all of them are negative outcomes. There's a mix, but we have no data, no examples in our data of successful culture change that didn't start at the top.
Wow.
That doesn't mean there isn't some discontent, there isn't some mismatch. People are not happy, but the CEO starts it. The business leader, it could be a business general manager, a division general manager, or a functional vice president, or whatever, or CEO. It starts at the top. And the reason for that is culture change is so difficult and so risky. You really can't expect some subordinate to take all the personal risks associated with that. We have examples in the book, we can talk about them, of where someone tried to change the culture, a manufacturing culture, for example, at a plant level, and was just absolutely squashed by corporate. And so that event delayed that culture change for almost 20 years. 20 years. one event. So it's a very, very risky thing.
Amazing.
We also, by the way, we have so it starts at the top, but then includes other people, includes everyone as the story building process proceeds. We can talk about that later in something we call a story cascade. But another thing that's interesting is we have no examples in our data set. I mean, zero. This is kind of an amazing, since the finding wasn't there. It doesn't. A successful culture change doesn't start with the announcement of a culture change.
Right.
No, the CEO doesn't get up and say, "Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a new culture in a year," and that's because that's just cheap talk. It's like, okay, absolutely, boss. Thanks for the heads up. I now know where to put my head down. I'll sign all the things. I'll go to the training. Blah blah blah. It just cheap talk. And so what matters is what the CEO does, not what the CEO says.
And
later on, there's a lot of talking, but it's all about action at the beginning.
Yeah, totally. So, all right. We've got number one, authenticity.
Okay. Yeah, it's authenticity. That's right.
It's obviously, you've got to be present.
It's critical. It's critical.
And you got to be consistent as a leader, because if you're inconsistent, you're just going to confuse the hell out of everybody.
But by the way, confusion is good. Let me say.
Tell me.
When you first start implementing these, engaging these new activities or inconsistent with the old culture, people who are very familiar with the old culture will look at what you're doing and say, "What are you doing? This is very confusing, Joey." That's a sign that you're moving in the right direction. So,
I love it. Awesome. Take me to number two.
Number two is you got to star in your own story. So this book is not about storytelling. And there's nothing wrong with storytelling where, you talk about, some entrepreneur or some incredible athletic achievement. All that stuff is great. Motivational, fine. It's great. It's probably good for communication. It has nothing to do with culture change. So this is about the business leader engaging in activities that are inconsistent with the old and consistent with the new culture. And so for that to happen, the business leader has to star in the story. He has to.
What does that mean, star in your own story? Tell me.
It means, well, let me give you an example. Let me tell you a story.
There we go.
So the seminal story of the book is the one that I heard at that lunch with my co-author, Manuel Emerald. He's going from an organization. This is a telecommunications company in Brazil that was in a regulated monopoly, and they had developed a very top-down hierarchical culture. And they're moving to a deregulated monopoly in telecom with new telecom competitors, plus the internet, mobile, telecom. It's just a radical change. And the old top-down culture was not going to work. He needed to have a customer-oriented, innovative, risk-taking culture. Opposite culture. For good strategic reasons. The old, we can go into that later too. But one of the products they have is a telecommunications, so internet connection product, and it's not working very well. And Manuel is the CEO. He buys this for his home, and it can't make it work. So he calls up the helpline. There's a story there too, but again, I'm looking to keep things short. He calls up the helpline, and he gets hooked up with this guy as a part-time call center employee, and they're on the phone for over an hour and a half trying to get this thing to work, and it never works. You can't get it to work. At which point, Manuel says to the guy, I'm the CEO of the company. And the guy says, "Yeah, right. Yeah, you're the CEO. You spent an hour and a half with me. You're not just CEO." I said, "No, I really am." And there's a story there too. But finally, Manuel says, "What will you need to know in order to have solved my problem?" And the guy says, "Here are the 14 things. There's a list of 14 things that I would have needed to know to be able to solve. And I don't know them. We don't have access to that information." I said, "Okay, next week is the executive committee meeting of the corporation. Would you and a couple of your colleagues be willing to come to that executive meeting and present this list of 14 things?" Okay, remember, this is top-down hierarchical culture. I'll give you some sense. In the old culture, no employee can get on the same elevator as the CEO.
Wow.
Okay.
And this
this
is a call taker getting invited by the CEO.
It's just turning the thing flipping upside down. Are you kidding me? It's this hourly employees, part-time employees are lecturing the senior management team.
Wow.
And about what needs to happen. And here are the 14 things, and they think that the call center guys, they go away, and the CEO says, "How many of these 14 things did you know about?" He said, "Well, we knew about 7." I said, "Okay, here's what we're doing. Step 1, we're suspending product sales of this product. We're not going to sell a product that we can't support. And by the way, all of their bonuses, including the CEO's bonus, depended on sales on that product." Wow. So he basically said, "This is authenticity, right? Say, we're not messing around. We're not going to sell a product that we can't support." Step 2, I want you guys, you two in charge of this, to tell us how we're going to get information on these 14 items. And I want you to present it at our next executive meeting, which was 2 weeks away. And oh yeah, by the way, you're going to present it to these call center employees as well as to us. Okay. And all that happens, and they turn it around, and that's the beginning. That's the beginning of this fundamental shift. Now, it could have been, it could have been the case that the way you solve that the CEO solved that problem is he could have called up the IT guy and the VP of IT in the company and said, "Listen, dude, I was on the phone for 2 hours and couldn't get this to work.
Right.
There were 14 things you need to know. Get this fixed." Could have done that way. But then he's not building a story. He's not changing the culture. He's solving the problem, which is the narrow problem, which is the technology's not working. But he's not solving the bigger problem, which is it's got the cultural mismatch. So he does it in a public setting, this executive committee, and he's there. He is making it happen. So he stars in that story that he's building.
That's awesome.
That's just a classic. Just that all these 6 attributes are very, very common. Almost all of them. There are very few stories where successful culture changes did not include the business leader starring story. I could tell you another one. We can go on too. So
wow. Okay. So folks,
I got 60 stories in the book. So
all right. Well, tell you what. This is a 2-part podcast. This is the end of part 1. On part 2, everybody make sure you tune in next week for more Jay Barney on how to change the culture in your organization. Remember, there's 6 attributes. We've been through 2 of them. The first one, authenticity. The second one, star in your own story. We will see you back on part 2 of 2 with Jay Barney on Start With a Win.